So it sounds like a lot of you already know Dr. McKetta. I think that her reputation precedes her, even if, you haven't taken a course with her. I know that most of us here have probably been advertising her courses just on our own. So I'll read you a short bio about her in case you aren't unfamiliar with her or in case you aren't sure what pieces to pick up first. So Elisabeth is an award-winning writer and writing teacher and a mother of two. With a PhD on the intersections between fairy tales and autobiography, as well as a 7-year streak of writing weekly poems for strangers, she teaches writing for Oxford Department for Continuing Education and for Harvard Extension School, where she won the highest teaching award, the James E. Conway Excellence in Teaching Writing Award. She has authored 13 books, most recently the Personal Growth Guide, Edit Your Life, right here, the based on the experience of living 3 years in a 275 square foot backyard guest house with her family of 4 and 5 if you count the Labrador. And most recently, the middle grade novel Arc, set during the pandemic and described by Kirkus Reviews as infectiously hopeful, which I think is a very accurate description. Elisabeth co-edited the anthology What Doesn't Kill Her, Women's Stories of Resilience, which Gloria Steinem described as stories that will help each of us to trust and tell our own. Her poetry and short work have been published widely, including in the Poetry Review and Real Simple. Her work with myth and memoir, which a lot of you have experience with, has been spotlighted in Harvard Magazine. Elisabeth and her family live in Boise and travel widely. All right, so let's get started. I would love to talk first a little bit about animals and more specifically the animals course that we did this summer. So for those of you who weren't able to come on campus, Dr. McKetta taught a wonderful course about animals based on the thesis that animals are good to think with. So can you tell us a little bit more about that course and about what it made you think about?
I would love to. And first of all, thank you so much for organizing this, for having me, for all of the beauty you have brought into my world with your writing and with just the ways that all of you add to the community. It's so fun to be here and to see all of you and to get to talk about writing for an hour. So thank you. Animals was a blast. Animals was what I think of as a wild card course. After COVID, I was so hungry to come back to summer and teach, and it somehow didn't feel right to teach a class I had taught before. It felt like it was a new era, and it felt like something entirely new was needed. So since coming back on campus for the summer, I have taught a new wildcard class each summer. And the first one was Underworld, writing the literary underworld, which Kat was in. We had a blast. And then last summer's was writing with animals. And spoiler alert, I'm hoping that they pass me to teach this summer writing the village, how we create villages in writing and think about how people affect each other. But to animals, I think that each of those wildcard courses, and I now see from a distance, I think that one reason why that came up and sort of seemed like a good idea was partly because I was working out the thematic issues related to that question in a book that I had recently, been editing or published. My first novel had a major underworld plot, and this past summer was I was in the sort of final copy edits for Arc, my first middle grade novel, that is about a girl who loses her house due to her parents' decision to move to a tiny house. That part is very familiar, and my kids are like, "Oh, I do not want to read that book because it just sounds too boring. We know all about that." But then it became a wonderful fiction about how when a girl's world shut down, I made her 11, when an 11-year-old girl's world shut down in terms of house changing, best friend moving, pandemic shutting down the world, and finally dog being given away. She spends the first half of the book furious with everybody for good reason, and then the second half taking matters into her own hands and rescuing all the animals that have been abandoned. So she finds her way into, like any good coming of age story, into her own kind of form of young adulthood. She also finds her empathy. I think beforehand she sort of thinks everything is annoying, but she finds her way, into empathy, into awareness of her own privilege. She has a house, she has a family, she has all sorts of things that many people don't have, and I think really felt the lack of during the pandemic. So her access point to empathy is through animals. So that was something that was really fun for me to think with. And it got me thinking a lot about the animals that that had taught me things and that I had loved and that had made it possible for me to access feelings or understandings or places, inner and outer places that I wouldn't have been able to, I think, with plain old ordinary humans. So our class was this wonderful guinea pig. We were all, I think, just like flinging animal terminology all over the place. It was 6 women. It was a tiny class. We met most of the time at Clover, and we all brought different questions about animals to the table, and the class took form really around those. And I think, most of the classes are this way. Mythic Memoir and others are really shaped by what, a man cannot step in the same river twice. No class can be the same because of the interests and the stories and sort of where each person is. So we had someone who had some really big questions about underwater creatures and whales. And we had, someone in the upper left corner of my screen who was thinking a lot about the environment and what happens when the sky turns different colors and there's smoke, and wanted to explore that in a story about a possum. So it ended up being this wonderful place for us to just, kind of a mirror for our concerns in the world, that at a primal level felt necessary to explore. And what better way than to explore, animals who are often the front line of processing the decisions that humans make. There's a quote that I think I actually can find within 15 seconds. And if it takes me longer, I won't. Okay, good. I had it up because I wanted to share it because I thought that's such a great quote. She's a Harvard philosopher named Martha Nussbaum. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. She wrote a book called Justice for Animals, Our Collective Responsibility. And one of the lines in it is, no non-human animal escapes human dominion. No non-human animal escapes human domination. Much of the time, that domination inflicts wrongful injury. Therefore, we owe animals a long overdue ethical debt. Is that great? It is a long overdue ethical debt, right? So I feel in a way our pieces this summer were highly, and I feel this is like a tricky word. This is like not a word I use often or lightly, but they were like very moral. They were about sort of like, what is the right thing? Like, what is the thing that doesn't hurt an animal if someone can help it? They were so interesting. Anyway, it was as much fun as I've ever had in a class and in a discussion. The writing that came out of it was fabulous. And people went into sort of deep and vulnerable places to pull out animal stories. What would you say, Kat? Were there any things that sort of that changed for you in terms of writing? I feel you have animals in a lot of your stories, but what are some themes that you've found that I don't know, that sort of link your thinking with animals together in fiction?
I did. I found it really interesting that the morality and ethics came up in pretty much every single story, and we were all sort of talking about the climate or inner turmoil in some capacity. So I think just thinking about the way other people think about animals and the specific animals that they chose was really interesting. We had 2 whale stories, which I never would have thought to write about a whale. I had just written a short story about the ocean, and I had a whale in it, but it wasn't, the target of what I was writing about. It was just sort of like a background character. And there was just so much beauty that was uncovered through all of these pieces, and just so much depth. I mean, one was a children's story, and it was a morality tale, and it was also, I would consider it a piece of climate fiction. But it was also a really sweet story about a girl learning to stand up for herself and others. And another one was about a girl's relationship with her father and with herself, and with her past mother. So I think just it's amazing to see the stories that come out of these amazing short condensed courses, because you really start to focus on what is the story about, and like Dr. McKetta always says, what is the story really about? So we definitely had a lot of discussions about that, and it was an amazing environment.
I love that, the about and the about, that they were all about, 2 very different things. And I think one of the lovely things, this is not relevant to animals so much, is the 3-week course. Have many of you done 3-week creative writing courses, just like sort of a thumb test or like a hand test? Who else has done 3-week? Okay, Nate, you have. They're crazy. Aren't they crazy? Margie, you have. They're so fast. And I think they're super intense. And I think part of and I love them, and I want to do them all the time. I think it's so fun. And I think part of the loveliness, and here I'm going to quote Michael Stubblefield. So you didn't know you'd be put on the spot, but you said in novel writing a year ago, you introduced us to the phrase, which which I feel I use like every week, which is to collapse the decision tree. Do you remember this? It's such a useful phrase. Yes, it was so useful because we were all like, but my novel could be in space. My novel could be at a vineyard. My novel could be. And part of what we were doing was like, here it's going to take place in a tiny house during COVID, like just figuring out like, here's what it's going to be. And I think for me as a writer, that is what takes the most time, is I'll have a direction and then, get feedback, have an idea, spend too long away from my manuscript, and new ideas will flood in, which is great. But then I question everything I've done and feel like, well, it clearly should be set in Paris and have a corgi and I need to start over. Whereas we didn't have time for that in 3 weeks, as Margie, Nate, like you just don't have time for that. So you have to just pick a direction. You sort of collapse the decision tree on day one, really. And then you just pick a direction and go. I think Nat, you are an example of that, because you came in with one story and you're like, this is going to be it. But then on the first day of class, you told us another story and all of us basically mutinied. And we're like, well, actually, you have to write this one. And there was sort of no time. You just sort of had to pick one and go. So anyway, I feel this is a shameless plug for the 3-week classes, but they really are just an interesting way to write fast and to see the quality of writing that comes from that kind of deep commitment that just doesn't have time to change its mind.
I love that it doesn't have time to change its mind. So I'll never forget when you taught us in pro seminar, we read Karen Russell's St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves. And now Karen Russell is one of my favorite writers ever and is a total inspiration to me. You described that story as deliciously verby. I'll never forget the phrase you used. You pointed out a technique where she utilized action verbs like sniffed, growled, pawed, to create that iconic animalistic characterization of the little girls. As a poet, how much do you think about language at the line level when crafting a world inhabited by animals, and how much does that come into your longer form writing?
Pat, you ask the best questions. And for those of you who have not read Karen Russell, you are in for such a treat. I just put the name of the story in the room, and I think I've read it enough times that I can probably quote the first sentence from memory. At first, our pack was all hair and snarl and floor-thumping joy. We forgot the barked cautions of our mothers and fathers, forgot the promises we made to be couth and kempt, ladylike, and that's where I lose it. But it's so verby and it's so delicious and it's so first person plural. It's so we, it's just this like feral we that gets dissolved because the nuns are like, be an I and conform. But it's so, but I feel one thing that comes up every time I discuss it I discuss it with a group in pro seminar, is just how much you feel you're in an animal. No, the sense of smell pervades it. You're in a wolf girl's nose. The senses. There's a sort of mantra throughout it is mouth shut, shoes on feet. Mouth shut, shoes on feet. Do not eat your shoes. You're just this sort of temptations that we would never think of as like, that's not what I'm tempted to eat. It's just so wonderful and so verby. And it was Karen Russell who really got me thinking about the relationship between, I'm sure I'd thought of it instinctively before, but she was the one who put it into words in a way that felt absolutely vital and that I feel I've been flinging at writers ever since. That she came to speak in Boise, Idaho, which is my home, and she said that the sort of typical question in any reading is like, what is your best advice to writers? And hers was, when you've asked that question before, like, isn't the answer usually like, have a writing schedule starting at 5 a.m.? Like, I feel that's usually the answer, right? It's like, get up as early as possible and write every day, which is excellent advice. But her advice was to read poetry. And I think that really surprised the audience. And I think that also really probably put a lot of people off, because I know a lot of people, including the person I'm married to, who I love dearly, who are very scared of poetry. Plenty of people are terrified of poetry. And that was her advice. And I thought it was such a wonderful permission to make part of the writing practice poetry, and to remember that at the end of the day, our tool, our paintbrush, what we work with is the sentence. And if we are writing beautiful sentences that are exciting and that are verby and that take our readers into places and into ways of seeing that they haven't thought of before, they're going to read whatever we write. Like we can write a piece about unloading the dishwasher and it will be brilliant if we write beautiful sentences. And that I feel that was really Karen Russell's gift to think about that. So I do fuss a lot with the sentences. And I think that's one thing that is really fun about short form, about a poem, about an essay. I know a lot of your short story writers. It's to get to really make the sentences perfect. With a novel, I think they're, you can make them as perfect as you can, but I think at the end of the day, a novel can maybe be at best between like 88% and 98% perfect, just because it's so sprawly. You can do your best, but like there'll be sentences that afterwards you're like, oh yeah. I just recorded one of mine as an audiobook, and like most of it was lovely, but there were a few that I was like, yeah, I'm a better writer now, but the poetry is key. And I think that one thing I've really come to as a poet who writes long form is a feeling that one of poetry's lessons, which is that the imagery conveys what I think of as an emotional souvenir. If I write a poem about feeling that my childhood home is no longer my home, like that's a feeling we can all identify with. It's like you leave home and you can't ever go home again, like totally universal, total cliche. Yet if I render it through the details of like how Austin smells like trees, and like what the hot nights feel like when you like come from the blast of the air conditioning to just like sweat within 30 seconds, like I can describe the specifics. And anyone who's ever lived in a hot place, in like a summertime place, would feel that nostalgia, and then, Kat can do the same with completely different details. Like every one of us could write a home, not home poem with completely different details. And I'm like looking at all of you and thinking about the details that I've read in your writing. Like your details would be great. We should all do that. Anthology, home, not home. But it's really the details that convey it. And I think that bringing that to long form, to novels and to memoirs and things, I think that it feels like an imperative to identify what the emotional souvenir is of what we're trying to write, which doesn't always come easily, and which is totally pro-seminar stuff, right? Like, what is the thesis? Put on your critic hat. But over and over, I think if we can figure out, what is this ultimately trying to leave us thinking or feeling or knowing? And we don't always know, and that's why good readers are key. That's the best thing we can do as a reader sometimes, is say, like, I think what your piece about trash is doing is teaching us this. Maybe Kat's like, that's not what I intended. Like I didn't want it to do that. Or Kat's like, that's brilliant, I'm going to do that. But it's so helpful because we often can't see our own pieces objective. But I think once we can identify, here's the truth at the center of it. Here's this like electric truth that we can only touch through imagery. Otherwise, we're being like a didactic, hit you on the head with a teaspoon kind of writer, which we're not. So then we have to go to poetry. And like for my ocean novel, I had, like the theme was about the sort of the way we contain each other's stories, and the way that part of our growing up process is to participate in this cycle of being what I call in the book fairy women, and it can be fairy men, people who sort of help ferry each other to the selves that they need to become over sort of turbulent waters. And the imagery everywhere was water. So whenever I needed to say something in that novel, the images that I would grasp for were all water or seashell or beach or sand or something having to do with ocean. And that was the poetry. The whole novel should make you feel just like soaked by the end. And then for Arc, the theme was about home, and it was about what happens if we, say, like, what does home mean? Is it just a box we sleep in? Is it a forever concept? Is it where the people we love are? How do we define home? And Arden is, my main characters really struggled with that. So all of the scenes that made the final cut were ones that had to do with home. Like for school, she is assigned a unit to build shelters, which she fails. And there's all sorts of imagery of like building cardboard homes and building Lego homes and thinking about homes for hermit crabs, like home. So when I tried to do imagery, I tried to make it sort of wooden. And, when I brought in fairy tales, they were of the Ark. I wanted it to be the poetry had to be about home. So I just love that idea. So anyway, that's a super long answer to a beautiful short question. But I love this idea that we can write sort of packed, verby, just stuff that has that kind of poetic imagery in the service of the sort of the bigger souvenir we want to leave with our readers.
I think that's a beautiful answer. So to recap, that's read poetry, figure out what the story is about and what it's really about, and have secondary readers, have tertiary readers, have, you know, a whole group of readers. I think that's been the most helpful thing. I think in every single class I've had with you, it's always been very workshop based and workshop driven. And we really value the input of our peers. And I think that's something that makes the magic in your classes. Um, Something else that I wanted to ask you about in regards to animals, has there been an animal that you've written about? I know you've had a couple essays, definitely poetry, and I know that this particular novel arc you write about cats, dogs, I believe birds, and a bunch of other different, you know, pocket pets. Has there ever been an animal that you've started to write about that has made you change the way you think about that animal, or has made you change the way you think about the world?
So this question just gave me goosebumps. This is a wonderful, powerful question, and I have an answer immediately. And I never would have thought of it in terms of that question. But one of the hardest animals that I've ever written about. And I think I have written about a lot of animals. My mom was the animal mom. Like we always had, in addition to the usual, like cats, birds, and snakes, we always had like, we once had a monogamous hamster couple that like bred all of the hamsters for the elementary school over like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years. We had like a rescue Malamute who like had all these puppies. And, you know, we had like a tiny dehydrated hedgehog who had to get an IV that the vet was like, this is the smallest IV I've ever done. And we had a pony briefly, like we had so many animals. But the one who I think was the hardest for me to write about, because she really challenged all of the things that I think about love, was my first dog. And I think that you know, translates for a lot of us who, you know, enter our 20s, you know, living by ourselves, but with the dog or the cat. That's our firstborn, you know, that's our true firstborn, the one that teaches us to sort of think beyond ourselves and to come home at reasonable hours. And that like, you can't not, you know, tend to this creature before you know, you have to tend to this creature before you tend to yourself. She was my girl. Her name was Goblin. I was 22. I knew nothing about training dogs, and I did a terrible job with discipline. And I think she, like, even the way I picked her out, was out of the back of a van in a parking lot in Maryland. And later on, I realized that was probably a puppy mill puppy. And I was 22 and I had no idea. I just didn't know. I just thought corgis are cute and let's get one. And there were 6 in the litter, and 5 were the sort of quiet, mellow dogs that now, again, we as adults all know, go for the quiet one, you know, go for the quiet one that doesn't cause any trouble. But I saw one that was jumping around and like nipping all of the siblings' ears and was so feisty and was so funny. And I was like, yes, that one, because I think I recognized sort of my own inner wild woman in her. You know, I just thought she was so feisty and so funny, and she would go on to be so entertaining and so smart. And I believe that we do create, you know, symbiotically, we create creatures that we can live with. You know, she and I lived together through my 20s, and she could travel anywhere, could sit on her bum, and if someone said fromage, could like open her mouth and catch cheese. Like she was just a fabulous, like my friends were like, I don't like dogs, but I love Goblin. Like she was our girl. But she didn't like other dogs. And I never socialized her. You know, I think she came feisty, but I never reined it in. And each year it got worse and it got worse and it got worse. And there were a lot of times, just a lot of incidents, like more incidents than there should have been. And I can only just look back on my 20s and think like I was dumb. I just like didn't want to believe that this creature I loved could harm anybody. But she did. And I have still scars on my hands. Like one time I took a piece of chocolate away from her that she had like found in my purse, and I took it out of her mouth because chocolate is poisonous to dogs. And she bit me so deeply that the doctor thought the nail wouldn't grow back. And my husband still has like goblin bites all over his hands. And our sweet Labrador, you know, by the time he died of, you know, old age, had, you know, goblin scars. I mean, she was a bully. She was a big bully. And we tried like a dog psychologist. We tried various trainers. We like tried all the things. We tried like taking her to like herd sheep so she could learn to like corral her aggression in productive ways. Like we went everywhere we could. And luckily my husband and I have never had the same, you know, knock on some wood, the same kind of like real fears about our children, knock on wood again, as we had about Goblin. I mean, I feel like we go on a date and be like, let's enjoy our date. But like, what do we do about Goblin? We tried changing her name to something nicer. We called her Tidy. Like we tried all the things. And ultimately we had to put her down because after we had a daughter, basically she was not a safe dog. You know, she had to live in a crate away from our daughter and our daughter's friends. And then the daughter learned to open the crate. And then, you know, neighbors would stop by with their dogs. And so I gave the orders to kill like one of the 10 beings on earth that I loved more than anybody else, because she threatened the rest of my life. And it was, I'm still, I think, processing sort of what that means, because that's horrible. And also she, I think, protected me, felt she was protecting me from the rest of my life, which wasn't going to work after. So that was the dog that it took me maybe, once I made the decision, I mean, even before that, even when she was just, when in my 20s, I felt like I had like 20 years worth of compost about Goblin, because she was funny and delightful and I loved her. And like she and I lived stories together, but I couldn't form it into a story until finally I did for my first essay collection. I was able to sort of close the Goblin narrative and sort of feel, I don't know, kind of like I could sort of thank her for loving me and protecting me. And I could also thank myself for being brave enough to put a dog that was that angry into peace, and to not have her eat my daughter. So I feel that was the hardest. That was a very, very, long answer for a short, beautiful question. But that was the dog that I felt challenged everything I felt or knew or believed. And I remember my mom said right before we made that decision, I hope this is the hardest decision you ever have to make. And it felt like one of those sort of mom blessings curses, like there will be harder decisions, but like, let's hope this is at that time that felt like the hardest one. But yeah, because I couldn't, I guess I felt like as a fairy tale person, I believe in happy endings. But thinking about Goblin, like she started as like the Cinderella in the castle. She started like eating cheese with a lot of graduate students. Like she was like in the pumpkin carriage with the glass slippers. Like things were sweet. But then each year, as she sort of got more dangerous, she lost privileges. And by the end, she was like, again, and like the fairy tale metaphors were not lost on me. She was basically like Rapunzel stuck in her tower. She was like a dog in her crate with no privileges, and no way to get out. And so it was this descent that felt incredibly the wrong direction. That felt like, like it had to, I think I needed to be able to see some sort of light and life in it in terms of like what was being loved so that Goblin could be let go, I guess.
Yeah, and that is just another way. Sorry, do you want to, Melissa, do you have a question? You can.
Yeah, but should I wait till the end? Should I wait till the end for questions?
You can ask.
Oh, I was just curious for Dr. McKetta if she felt like to write, because it was such a traumatic story or essay to write, do you feel like you had to be at a certain point in your life or have a certain amount of distance from that incident for you to be able to sort of process it in a way to then be able to write about it?
Absolutely. That's a wonderful question. And I think that's something that I'm looking again at mythic memoirists. I think that's something that we've all talked about, is that when the story is still going on, we don't know how it ends, or we can't quite have acceptance or distance from how it ends. So it took me, I think, I think over 10 years to be able to, and I even had a compost that was called Cinderella in Reverse, that was all about like this dog. And one of the lines in it that made it into the final essay about it was, I've wasted my love on a bad dog, because I did feel that my whole 20s was sort of shoring up like so much, like all of the sort of maternal love was like on this dog that was like attacking everybody. But yeah, so it did need time, did need a lot of time. And I think I needed time to sort of forgive myself. And there's this wonderful piece that memoirists, you're probably like, oh God, don't talk about the hermit crab piece again, but I'm going to talk about the hermit crab piece again. There's this wonderful piece, and I'll write it in the room because it is so good. Her name is Brenda Miller. It's called A Case Against Courage. And when it was published in Chronicle of Higher Ed or Writers, it was one of the, anyway, you can Google it with that. It had a huge hermit crab on the cover. And basically the premise was that when we're writing memoir, or when we're using our life as fodder for our fiction, which we all kind of do in some form, we all use it consciously or unconsciously, stuff that we know from our imagination, our experience, like it's going to find our way into the stuff that we write. And what Brenda Miller argues is that when we take experience, trauma, when we take the things that have been the hard stories in our lives and first of all, eject it through the physical act of writing it, that there's some sort of catharsis through that, which I think we can all probably feel and acknowledge, that all of a sudden it's not this sort of horrible infected thing rattling around. It's like not a haunted house anymore. It's just like a story on the page. We're like, oh, that's not so bad, or that is bad, but like it happened and it's out of my body now. So there's the first sort of the physical act of ejecting the story, which is hard and hurts. And I think that's the part, and I'm like looking at the memoirist's face, like, isn't that the part where you're like, why did I sign up for this class? That's the part where I always like do U-turns on essays. I'm like, this is dumb. Like this is supposed to be fun. This is not fun. But it's so important and it's so healing to have the story out, because then it just becomes a story and it happened to someone. And we as humans identify, we're empathetic. Like we don't want things to hurt people, and if that person is ourselves, we can see it as a story in a way that I think takes away the shame and takes away, I think we can sort of forgive the parties in it in a different way and see it with maybe more objectivity when we write it. So then we've got this thing written that is like fit for nobody. One of my students calls it the preach from the scar, not from the wound. Like that's the wound draft, like no one needs to see that draft, except for maybe our generous peer group, we'll be like, okay, here's what we can do. But then we start shaping it. And then we start asking, what is it telling us? And what is its souvenir? And what is it, what is its energy and aliveness, and what in it is ranty versus beautiful and wise versus redundant. And we can sort of sift through it. And then all of a sudden it becomes, this goes to the poetry and the verbiness, it becomes beautiful, like crazy beautiful. And we find patterns and we find symbols, and it's filled with these images that like we wrote about something that was horrible or difficult, or like that we thought we'd never tell anybody as long as we lived. And so then we've got this like gorgeous artifact made of that. And we fling it out of the world, and in some cases it gets published. Here's to you, Margie. I was so happy that yours did. And then people sometimes I know are like, I can't, sometimes then people will receive it and it will move them as much as it moved us to experience it and write it. And they'll feel all sorts of things, and they'll come to us and say like, oh, that was so brave. That must have been so hard. Like, can we talk about this? And you as the writer, and this is what Brenda Miller argues, you as the writer, that's not the courageous part. Like the courageous part was long ago when nobody saw it. Like you've already created it into an artifact and it can't hurt you anymore. So by the time it's sort of out there for people to consume and enjoy and learn from and feel, like you have this sort of weird objectivity that people are like, wasn't that sad? And you're like, well, yeah, but now it's a story. Like now it's a story. Like, no, not really. Like it's a story. Stories happen to people. Like that are, hard across the board. Yeah, anyway, that are hard and beautiful, and we get, so anyway, so there's this wonderful sort of, the shaping of it, that comes with that distance is so cool. And I think I'm like, looking at your faces, like you've all had that happen, right? Like the story comes out and suddenly it can't hurt you anymore. It can't hurt you. It's the coolest thing.
I love that answer. And thank you for the question, Melissa. So I wanted to focus on arc for our next question. I wanted to know, as an essayist and memoirist, was it difficult to pare down the important true events, the real life events that happened in the story? Or did you find it easier to pull from your imagination and your love of fairy tales to lean into the fiction? How did you balance that?
I love this question. Thank you for these wonderful questions. So ARC came on the tails of She Never Told Me About the Ocean, which was my first published novel and impossible to write. It was one of those novels, and I know we've talked about this in class a lot, where my ambition was just like beyond the screen huge. Like it was going to be a mythology of women and of like mothers and daughters, the way that like Star Wars is a mythology of like fathers and sons. Like like my ambitions were huge, and like my skill couldn't do it, and so part of the process of writing Ocean was just like doing anything I could to like wrench my skill higher. Like I would make it as good as I could and be like, okay, this is every skill I have. And still it wasn't good enough. And I knew it wasn't good enough. And the publishing industry knew it wasn't good enough. So then I put it aside for a year, write something else. And then and still my ambition's up here, but I'd like take a screenwriting class and, learn more about plot and climax. And, so here, Karen Russell remind me about poetry. And then I get it up here and be like, okay, I've given it everything again. Like I'm tapped out, here you go. And then same thing, like I'd read it over and be like, and the publishers and agents are like, oh, no, thank you, dear dummy. So then the whole thing would like cycle back. It was so goddamn hard to write that book. It was so hard. Sorry, I shouldn't have cursed on recording, but it was so hard. And it was not my first novel. I had written several other, I'd written several other novels that I think of as training wheel novels beforehand. You know, one NaNoWriMo novel, two during college. Like I had a couple of books under my belt that never need to be published, but that you know, taught me that I liked the process of big books and I like thinking in books. But this one I really had to get right, and I got it, you know, as close to right as I could, and still it wasn't perfect. But I felt that by the time it was published, it was ready. It was sort of beautiful in its reach and beautiful in its flaws, and like it did what I needed it to do, so I could let it go. But it was so hard to write, and it was such a relief to finish it and feel like I never have to do that again, which is what I felt after doing my first marathon and my only marathon. Like the only way I finished, I was like, never again, never again, never again. And I thought I wouldn't believe myself because I'd been a runner since I was 11. So, but I like after the marathon, I was like, okay, I'm not sore anymore. I'm just going to put on my running shoes, and I put them on, and I went outside, and I would not run, and I have not run, and I was 22 then, and I'm 44 now. Like I would not do it again. And I thought it would be kind of like this with the novel. And I was like, I'm never going to do this again. This is like way too costly of time and energy, and like a novel is so hard. So I wrote all these other things, which was fun, but you know, in the years when I was trying to get Ocean right, but then I had the idea for ARC in, I guess, February of 2020, and it came sort of all of a sudden, like the idea for Ocean had, and it was just a perfect idea of, you know, taking our tiny house experience, taking this sort of archetypal qualities of my then, I guess, 9-year-old daughter, who's so lovely and smart and has 4 lawyers as grandparents. Like she's just she can argue anybody out of anything. She's so fierce. She's so wonderful. And she has such a sense of like how things should be done properly. You know, like there's just like, and I actually, in Arden, I counted, Arden uses the word proper, I think like 7 times. Like things need to be done properly. And like her parents weren't doing things properly, and her brother wasn't doing things properly. She's just this force. And so I thought, what if a kid like that, you know, like what is it like for a kid like that? And then I thought, what, you know, and I was sort of trying to conflate things that really did happen in our life. Like we did do a dog share when we moved into to our tiny house, which we called the shed, because we didn't have, you know, because part of our hope was that we travel half the year, which we did, and have continued to do. So we ended up setting up, and also the house was, I mean, the size of the table that I'm sitting, it was tiny. So we ended up doing a dog share with this lovely retired couple who could take the dog when we were traveling, and ended up training her to be a therapy dog. So she sort of became more their dog, which was really hard for the kids. So I was sort of processing all these things of like, what, you know, like each one of these, I think for my son felt like he was, you know, little enough that he felt like, well, this is cool. Like now we have a little house, and like, this is cool. Now we have more time to go to the museum because, you know, or now we get to see Posey once in a while, and like she's excited to see us instead of bored of us. Like whereas my daughter was like, oh, like, you know, why are you doing this to me? And so I tried to sort of conflate all these things from her point of view, and it just all snapped into place. And always I have a fairy tale in the center of everything I write. My biography of my grandfather was Jack and the Beanstalk. Ocean was various heroine-driven fairy tales with stepmothers. Like always there's a fairy tale. And so the story of Noah's Ark felt like such an obvious one that all of us were gearing up. You know, it was pretty clear by late February, we were all gearing up to live inside our own little arks. And we were just going to like weather down and hope that the rain stopped eventually, and that we'd maybe like see a bird or an olive branch, but we were all going there. So it felt like the right fairy tale. It also felt like a really fun kind of compost heap to have a place to sort of put all the compost basically of our life. So the premise came in a snap, and then I waited until I had sort of finished a couple of obligations and had kind of clear mornings ahead of me. And then I set out to write it, and I wrote the draft in 40 days, which feels very appropriate to an ARC story, and felt like such a gift from like the writerly universe after Ocean, which just felt impossible. And part of what made ARC easy was that, you know, it was COVID, so I didn't have that much else going on. You know, like nothing was gonna interrupt. There was like no fun alternative for like, you want to go to the pub? I'm like, no, and like I can't. Like nothing was so in a way that, you know, that kind of clear focus allowed it. But also it was just this lovely processing ground that I was able to compost our life into fiction. And then once the draft was done, and I'd love to show you, I would love to show you the way I wrote it, because I think this method is going to be how I write novels forever after, because it really made it safe. It was very economical. It saved a lot of time and trouble, and I would highly recommend it. So I'll show you the ARC method. But the hard part ended up being, so the draft came very quickly, and then I was able to sort of shape it into pieces. And by that point, I had learned from Ocean all these lovely things about plot that I didn't know the first time around. So I was able to figure out like, this is the midpoint. This is when she accepts that her dog is gone. This is when she shifts from being angry to feeling like, well, she surrenders and has to do something. This is all these things. So I sort of felt a little clever with the like, haha, here's the pinch, here's the other pinch, in ways that I just, which felt like new knowledge to me. So that was very exciting. And I finally outlined, I had sort of a loose outline before I wrote, which also was new. So all these things sort of made it a pleasure to write. And, but there was still sort of stuff from our life. Like, for example, in the middles are always so hard. In the middle, there was this, the themes were pretty clear. The beginning and the end were pretty tidy, but the middle had this like enormous gloppy scene about Easter, which had nothing to do with anything else. And I knew it, but it was so sweet. And it was sort of about animals too. And it like showed so much about the siblings, but it like didn't have anything to do. And it was 40 pages, and like Easter didn't need to go there, but I sort of couldn't kill that darling. And so I kept like sending the manuscript to my wonderful editor at Paul Dry and being like, here it is, I've changed it. I've left in Easter. And finally at the end, it was too long, and we all knew Easter shouldn't be there. And I felt that like not being able to face the fact that I felt that I was just like being a little, head in the sand about that. And I felt that there was a point where I just sort of tapped out as an editor and was like, once again, like I've gotten it as good as I could, but here the door had opened and I did have a publisher who wanted to publish it. So I felt that I had more, I had the gift that time around that I didn't have with Ocean of a really good editor who was ready to publish it. So basically I flung it at Julia. It was, and you and Igor and others from Capstone have met Julia. She's this lovely woman in her 30s who's just a brilliant mind for story and just like a really generous, careful editor. Who asks hard questions about the stories that make them bigger and better. Like I gave her like a 98% perfect Ocean, and she asked the questions that took it to 100. Like she's just a brilliant editor. And so I finally like flung at her arc, and I was like, like this is as far as I can go. Do something to it. And later on, Julia wrote me back. She's like, I think this is the most invasive editing job I've ever done. But she basically just like lopped off Easter and changed a couple of other things that were sort of giving trouble. And so in the acknowledgements, I called her the book's other mother, because she really was like, she like, like it couldn't have been done without Julia just being like, all right, here we go. Like, I'm going to toilet train the thing. Like you're clearly not going to be able to do this. So it was really a wonderful, wonderful moment at the end. But I did read it aloud to my family, and I changed people significantly, that there was nothing that felt, the spirit of certain, my son's sort of Buddha baby nature was in there. My daughter's like, fierce intelligence and sort of, animal loving, morality was in there. But the mom and dad were kind of caricatures. So things change, the mom needed to, they had to have, different qualities that supported the plot about home. So lots of things changed, but one delight about it that was really fun was that a friend of mine in Boise read a draft and adapted it into a stage play. So over the summer, we got to see like our characters being acted out. And my husband afterwards was like, I think I like Dad better than I think he's like a better dad than it was this wonderful moment of like, he's a really good dad. Like, I wish I were more like Dad. Okay, so let me show you the ARC method right now. Is this a good time to do that, Kat?
This is the perfect time. Please do.
Yay. Okay, perfect. Let's pull up. So this is such a wonderful, and again, like any tool, use it to the extent that it works for you, and ignore the parts that don't. But I just have, this was such a pleasure. So here we go. Actually, you know what? I think you need to give me screen share. And while you're setting up screen share, I'll sort of set up the system. So I think one of the things, this goes back to perfect, thank you. This goes back to the Michael Stubblefield Collapse the Decision Tree, where I know myself to be the worst. Like I think we all know ourselves as writers, that there's certain things, there's certain eras where we're likely to be in flow, and like all writing feels lovely and easy, and like, why is it ever hard? And then there are eras that are just like, we're bound to be stuck. And where I traditionally tend to get stuck is by kind of faffing about with like too many open doors for what the thing can be, rather than just like picking one and making it what it needs to be. So I knew that I was perfect. I wanted to, have a streamlined process, unlike Ocean. And I knew that in order to simplify that, I had to do something that I'd never done before, which is have, at least for the first draft, a single file, one file for the book, instead of a folder with like character charts and outlines 2.0 and outlines 3.0 and final draft, final draft, final, read this draft, just like all this stuff that you sit down to write and you're like, can't navigate this, this is too much. I needed to keep it simple for myself. And I needed to minimize the amount of time that I would spend questioning the premise and the structure of the book. I just needed to write forward and get it down, and spend as much time in the part of writing that I love, which is the creation. I love to just fling spaghetti against the wall and not worry about whether it's good or bad, but just like write it. So I knew I needed to give myself an ambitious kind of create count each day. I needed to have what am I trying to say? I needed, decision tree. There's something else I was going to tell you, but I don't have time. So we'll come back to that. I needed to sort of live in the creative part as much as possible. So I needed to sort of keep the sort of thinking about it to a minimum. So I set up one file on my desktop right here, and it was called ARC. And it started with, the title was, I don't know if you can see here, it says ARC 100. And this one I've tidied up a little bit for you. But the original just said ARC 0, meaning I had written zero pages. But I decided that I would allow myself 2 crutches to write this story. And I would be able to search for both of them very easily without giving myself any trouble. So you'll see in my box, I'm putting in end materials. So on the final page of the document, of the single file, I put I collapsed the decision tree. I put a description of what this thing was going to be. And it's, pretty simple. It ended up being the compost for the back page copy, but that changed a little bit. But when a pandemic threatens their city, Arden and her family must stay quarantined in their tiny house built like a wooden boat. As their neighbors leave town, shut down and die, leaving their pets to care for, Arden becomes the safekeeper of all the abandoned animals. A fiction in verse that reflects true stories of living big in small spaces during times of crisis, ARC is a modern retelling of the ancient story about a family and its animals striving to keep themselves and their world safe. And those of you who've been in my classes probably are like X-ray visioning this and thinking to yourself, this is a moonshot sentence, right? Like this is an ideal version sentence. Like this is just like in its ideal version, what's it going to do? This. So this is something I'm always like fussing at writers to do, but it's so helpful to just say like, here's the target. Like here's, it may change, but like, this is what we're working on. So I put it right here so I couldn't avoid it. And then I gave myself a couple of other kind of boundaries. One of them is the structure. I thought I was going to do it in poems at first. That ended up unraveling into prose. Was it going to be, what was the time frame? Was it 40 days? It ended up being longer. But I thought, let's start with poems. And then my plan, this was gold, write 5 poems a weekday, and then bulletin board them in acts once I got to 100 poems, jotting down, roughly which of the 5 kind of tentative acts they would be in. Notice what is missing, add to prompts, write the end, and then edit. And so here's my bulletin board. It's like sort of, you can't really see it. My sweet husband built this, but I just sort of, put sort of generally speaking, what was gonna, the beats. I guess I kind of put it was like a beat sheet. But my only job each day was to just write 5 poems. And the good, lovely trick of this is that look how short a poem can be. Let's find a short poem. These are prose poems, but some of these are really, you'll see some when we go back up, but a lot of them are little blocky prose poems. You can see how this is very short. I tell Sophie in a letter about each animal's personality and how they all sleep together in the treehouse. She writes back, I think it's so rad that you are the safekeeper of all the lost animals. That counts. So I would do 5 of those a day, and then I would watch the document grow each day by ARC 5, ARC 10. And my goal was always to have added 25 by the week's end. Then I take the weekend off. And the way that I set it up to make sure that I knew what to write, a few other things. I put down to the best of my ability what I thought was going to change, which again, I didn't think about any of this with Ocean. I just like waded in and was like, bring on the story. But I thought, okay, what happens here? She goes from a child to a capable young adult. Her 2 parents work securely, to their family becomes a little scrappier, and Arden works too. I sort of put all the little arcs here for ARC. And so that when I was sort of wondering what I should be writing, I thought I should be writing between these, like I should be writing what is in this arrow, basically. That's the stories in this arrow between these things. And then I thought about what's kind of opening and closing in each act. And I thought, okay, well, in the original version of it, school closes, city closes, parents' job close, but Arden is opening into sort of herself as a provider. she saves her grandmother, she opens the door to help, she saves her grandmother's dog specifically, and then the world opens again. That changed, but that sort of helped me think about this idea of like not just writing in a static way, like, and then they were having fun on Easter, which I did for 40 pages, but we came from here to here, trying to sort of think in terms of what changed. And then I put an epigraph, which made it into the final copy because I love to fiddle around with this. And I could easily spend an entire 4-hour writing day like on acknowledgements, which I thought I'm just going to give myself that pleasure here, but I'm not going to give myself any more than this page. And then I just had a running note to my editor here. So this was the whole page of like all of the structure stuff. So I really kept it contained and didn't procrastinate with it. Like I don't go on Facebook, like, but this is where I procrastinate. I'm like, oh, let's just make a perfect plan then and never execute on it. So this really helped me kind of take away that temptation for me. And then the simplicity of the 5 was made easy because on the page before that, I put prompts. And so again, if I search the document, if I put in here, prompt, what should come up is this. It takes me straight to the prompts. And each time I had an idea, I would just, type it on my phone. Like I'm like, the family has an jar, which again, we have an jar. So that was easy. But then, there's a grandmother who I invented. And I needed to show some joyful moments. I also needed to show, I sort of, there's things I needed to do some stuff. And so this was just my place of saying, here are some things that I think belong in this story. And I put each one as a prompt. So then each day I would just basically take, any 5 of these and say, okay, right now we're going to work on this. And I would just bring it up and write. That would be the first prompt. And so these would just build in this way that here's Easter. Look at all this Easter. It's ridiculous. You're not going to get to see the Easter in the book. It was nonsense, but it was fun to write. So anyway, so it was just a way to see it build 5 pages by 5 pages by 5 pages in a way that felt like a challenge, but ultimately low pressure because I knew what I was asking of myself. And then when the draft was done, it was all in one place. And it happened so quickly that I didn't have time to sort of get bored of it, as sometimes I've done with other books. So anyway, if that is useful to you, please adapt it and use it and just, and I can also send you a cleaned up version of this if you want, but just basically like your manuscript, your prompts, and just like your framing devices. So that is the ARC template that was, that saved the day.
That is so amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. I've seen that document before, but only in passing. So it's really amazing to get another glimpse behind the curtain. I hope that you've all found this helpful as well. And if anybody has questions, you can put them in the chat. I think we're going to open up for some Q&A now.
So Michael Stubblefield put a question in the meeting chat questions, asking for some suggested poetry that would be inspirational for writers to read who I don't think he added this part, but maybe who aren't that familiar with poetry that would be inspirational for writers.
Oh, I love this. That's a great question. I think that it's one of a really good resource to start with is just poetry.org, which poetry.org. It's just a wonderful, pretty easy to navigate website that has tons of poems on them by people you've heard of, people you've never heard of, and it's an ongoing sort of container of some really lovely poems throughout the ages. And my personal taste tends to be for the more free verse modern poetry, although I always love, once in a while to read some of the like old Wordsworth aloud. But I think and this is a practice I feel I need to like put my money where my mouth is, because I'm going to say this to you, but like I should also be doing this myself. Why not just go there once a day, when we're tempted to do something else, and just like read a poem before checking email and just, see how it feels, read it aloud. Then it takes 30 seconds and we go on with our day. But I think that would be a really good practice. And I might check in with me, Kat. I think I should do that. I think we should all do that, right? It's just one poem. And then you sort of get a taste for it. The poets that I'm excited about. Oh, good idea, Kat. The poets that I'm excited about right now, I'm obsessed with one poem called Good Bones, which I find I keep like bringing up in conversation by, I think her name is Maggie. I think her name is actually Maggie Smith, like the other Maggie Smith. But it's a poem about sort of what we do and do not tell our children, and how we have to be like real estate agents to sell them the world and tell them like, you can make this place beautiful. It's a gorgeous poem just about like seeing the world for what it is, but also having to sort of tell only half of the truth to those who inherit it from us. It's gorgeous. So I'm obsessed with her. I love Sharon Olds. I always think Sharon Olds is great. I love the ones who sort of talk about family, because I think that's fun. I love the ones who talk about fairy tales. I mean, I think the main thing is just any poet you like counts, and any poem you like counts. And it could be Dr. Seuss, it could be Shel Silverstein, homework, I hate you, you stink. It could be anything, but just something that gets you thinking about words. Those of you who have, you know, kids or hang out with kids, like I feel I got a lot of poetry mileage in our house by starting two traditions, both of which we've sort of fallen on now. But for a while, instead, like some families will like say a prayer before dinner. I would encourage my children to say a poem before dinner. And we got a lot of Shel Silverstein, a lot of my beard grows to my toes, I never wears no clothes. But now we all know that poem. And then for a while, when I was like really desperate to, I don't even know what, just like get them to care about this thing that I cared about, I would offer them $1 for each poem they memorized. And that was ridiculous, because they would be like, nature's first green is gold. Oh, yeah, but it was like, so I just felt that I sort of try, I feel like any chance I have to bring it into my life, I do, you know, because it's just, I think poetry is like such a pleasure, but it's also such a good discipline. Like it's such a good discipline to think about every single word. But I think the right answer is just like whatever poem you like is the right answer. And I think that thinking about Karen Russell, like who's to say, you know, Ark's an example of something that was written in poems, but that reads as prose. I'm obsessed with the books right now by Lauren Wolk. Sorry. And she's also a poet, and who's just, so I mean, I guess I feel like very, very foggy in the lines between poetry and prose. Like if you read something that just like knocks your socks off because it's so beautiful, like we're just going to count that as poetry. So it may be rereading Karen Russell, or it may be rereading Ben Percy, or maybe rereading Circe. But I think just anytime you stop and pay attention, you know, you close read, I think that's really the kind of poetry thing. It's a great question.
All right, thank you so much for that answer. I think everybody should read poetry. It's not, it seems like it's this very stuffy kind of pursuit, and you know, you think that people who write poetry are they're all wearing berets and they're all like lounging against a tree in the courtyard in a university, but it's really very accessible, and everybody should read and write and listen to and encourage others to listen to poetry, because it makes your writing so much better. So we had the question from Melissa, do you think it's harder or easier to write about animals when you love them so much? How do you feel about that?
I love that question. I have had a conversation recently with my pro seminar students, including Meryl from our wonderful class, about how sometimes it's harder to write about things we love more than things we can be critical of. And it's one of those weird truths that I kept bumping into in academic writing in college, that I could write much better. You know, I couldn't be critical. I'm so sorry about all the noise. I couldn't be critical about the things that I loved. And I think it's that way with, you know, with our lives as well. When I did my 7-year Poetry for Strangers project, each week I would ask a stranger for a word. And it was so interesting that the words that I would get that would be more typically thought of as like poetic words, like love, or, you know, nature, or things that were like poetic concepts, those I think were the hardest ones to do in poems. Whereas when I got words like stupendous or pinwheel or brewery, like I could do stuff with that because it was sort of more angular. I don't know, like I could do, so I mean, I guess I think that we, I don't know, I feel that when we love something, it's like such a unformed feeling. It's just like such a simple, like, I love you. You know, it's so simple. There's like nothing ironic. There's nothing clever. There's nothing sharp. It's just like, I want to give you a hug. It's so I think that like, but that's obviously not an interesting story. So this question about how to sort of take love, which I think is like the base of most things we write about that are any good. You know, I'm like looking at all of you and the things I've read in yours, like is love of daughter, love of partner, you know, love of animal again, you know, love of, and, you know, love of so many things, you know, love of someone we're not supposed to love, love of city. Oh my gosh, Igor, love of city, you know, love of childhood best friend, like that if, I think it goes back to that like invisible souvenir, like if the invisible souvenir has something to do with, you know, with love, I think we have to just find, we have to find a container for it that makes it something that can be delivered, you know? So I think it is very hard to write about things that we care the most about, but it's also the most rewarding.
I love that. It's most rewarding. That's I think that falls in line a lot with your personal essay collections, because you're writing about things that are so close to your own heart, and you've got to keep that psychic distance while you talk about them, while at the same time uncovering these, universal truths. So it's how do you balance that when you're so passionate about it, but you don't want to be too close to what's to the meat of it. It's a balancing act being a writer. um, so we have another question from Alex P. And I'm sorry if you have are you okay to stay or?
No, I would love to stay late. And I'm so glad you brought up Alex's question about archetypes. Alex, I love this question. And I learned something over the summer from, most of you probably have taken classes with Katie Cohen. Right? You love Katie Cohen's amazing. Yes, Katie Cohen's the best. She taught me something that she may have taught you that I thought was so interesting. And I've not been able to find a good online resource for this, although I've tried mightily. But it's called, she introduced it to me as the Four Corners narrative technique, if I can spell technique. And the more I've Googled it, I've not really found much of it. But I think it's attributed to John Truby. But again, I've read his book and I don't remember it, but I guess I probably haven't read it for a long time. So what do I know? But anyway, but what Katie said was more interesting than anything I found online. So let me see if I can find a piece of paper and show it to you. What do I have here that I can show you to? Well, I'll just use my hands. So I'll use mine here. I'll use mine. Hold on. Here we go. So index card. So we've got, think of like a think about like a 4-square court, from when you're a kid on the playground, right? You've got 4 corners, you've got 2 lines and 4 corners. And the 4 corners narrative theory suggests that the thesis is in the middle, and that the story, here, I'll make it bigger. The thesis is in the middle. So say the thesis is, let's think of a good one, Hunger Games. Probably most of us know Hunger Games, right? So say Hunger Games, the thesis is, and she said this in interviews, like when Suzanne Collins wrote Hunger Games, what she said was that she came to the message before the characters, which is not how most of us write, I think, but she wanted to explore and explain just war theory for children. I had to look that up. I didn't know what just war theory is, but apparently it's something that people like philosophers and lawyers and generals have been arguing about for like 2,000 years about, we all agree that war is not a good idea, but under what circumstances is it just to go to war? And so some people are like, well, when people steal my China, and other people are like, no, when someone steals my dog, oh no, when someone steals my, whatever. So like everyone has a different opinion, but everyone agrees that under some circumstances, war is just. So that's what just war theory is about. And she wanted to write about that for kids, which is like a tall order, like talk about a big ambition. And so the idea is that, so if we know what our theory is, our thesis, like in some cases, war is just. Our main character, in our case, our Katniss, is going to be the vector. So picture like a pinwheel, like in a board game, wherever Katniss spins throughout the story, in the end, she is going to be a vector toward the thesis, right? Like at the end, Katniss points toward the thesis, which is like, in some cases, it's just to go to war. The antagonist is going to be the opposite. And in this case, it's Cornelius, somebody, Snow, who would say, never is it a good idea to go to war, because if you go to war, I lose power and you kill me, for very selfish reasons. He does not want people to go to war because right now he's got it pretty good, and they don't, and he's selfish and horrible, and but he's the antagonist and he's the anti-war, but for an antagonist reason. And where it gets interesting, and again, picture Katie Cohen explaining this. Like, it's so fun to sort of like, it's such a joyful, like, and she's like, this is where it gets good. So we've got our protag, great, they prove the thesis. We've got our antag, great, they oppose the thesis. But then on these two sides, we have one person who supports the thesis, but shows the underside of it, and shows why it isn't that, why it's more complicated. So like in this case, we might call that, I think about this, we might call that Gale, right? Gale's like, yeah, we should go to war. We should go to war immediately. He wanted to go to war on like page 3. He's like, let's go to war. But he also is careless and kills Katniss's sister. Sorry, spoiler alert. But like, he thinks war is great because like, there's no dignity in being oppressed. But he shows like, he and Katniss are on the same side, but he shows how there's an ugly underbelly to the thesis, right? With me on that? Like there's, so archetypally, like there's and then on this other side, we've got Pita, who's profoundly anti-war, but is also like, he believes like communication can solve all things. And he's like kidnapped and tortured. And like at the end shows that like there's a downside to being anti-war. So like basically this idea that like if we're all kind of in a pinwheel around the thesis, these two support it, but this shows the underbelly. These two support the antithesis, but this shows the sort of the light side of it in a way. So I know it's kind of a long answer, but I love this side. But anyway, it's really changed, Alex, how I think about my characters. I've always believed that if I can get as few characters as possible in as many places, I'll have rich characters who are like deep and knowable, and like a rich world where you feel like it's inexhaustible. So that's always been sort of a writing tenet that has felt true. So with Arc, I like collapsed the grandmother and a godfather into like a ninja grandmother. Like I did a lot of collapsing. But this idea of thinking of them in terms of kind of an archetypal wheel around a certain thesis, I think is so interesting. That's like not an answer at all to your question, but that's like the first thing I thought of when you said that.
It's a perfect answer, because when I've approached roles, I always have to consider what is the motivation of the character. And the problem is that the character's motivation is constantly shifting as the circumstance is shifting, and their own psyche is changing as they're developing over time. So I may be pro-war, but then I keep seeing the person next to me that's very pro-war, showing how ugly it is. Now I'm starting to become reserved, and I start switching to the other side. And that constant shifting has to somehow play out in a way that's not only believable, but entertaining. Otherwise, no one wants to see it. But it's so compelling. So thank you for that. I never considered it that way. That's very interesting.
Thank you for that. Let me know what, you've got my cat, just put my email and my website in the room. Let me know what comes of it. I imagine, like, as someone who works with stage, that all sorts of interesting things happen in sort of that geometry of people that, sparks all sorts of different stuff. Yeah, let me know what comes of it. I feel I'm only like just beginning to think about how I might use that in my own writing. So like I learned this from Katie over the summer, but it feels like a souvenir that I will keep in my sort of writing box of tools.
Absolutely. I love that one. Thank you so much for sharing. You've shared so many resources today. You've shared so many theories and so many of your own techniques and everything. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to meet with us and just share your excitement and joy of writing. So thank you so much for everything today and always. It was great talking to you.
Thank you. This has been a joy of my day and my week. I'm so happy to get to talk with you all. Keep me posted on all of your comings and goings and writings. Kat, thank you so much. And see you all again soon.
All right. Thank you all for coming.